Sir, ma'am, please step aside. These seats aren't available for people like you." The words hung in the air like a death sentence delivered with the kind of practiced cruelty that comes from years of unchecked authority. Carmen Rodriguez, the lead flight attendant for Transatlantic Airways Flight 447, stood blocking the jet bridge entrance with her arms crossed, her smile as fake as a $3 bill. She was looking directly at Marcus Thompson and Dr. Sarah Mitchell, an interracial couple who had just presented their boarding passes for premium select seats 7A and 7B. What Carmen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 17 minutes, her words would trigger a chain reaction that would cost Transatlantic Airways $3.2 million, destroy 4 careers, and reshape the entire aviation industry. But let's rewind to how this nightmare began. 3 hours earlier, Marcus Thompson had been standing in his home office in Arlington, Virginia, carefully folding his favorite polo shirt into his carry-on bag. At 45, Marcus was a man who commanded respect without demanding it. His quiet authority came from 18 years of working his way up through the Federal Aviation Administration from aircraft mechanic to senior air carrier safety inspector. He was the kind of man who could ground an entire fleet of planes with a single signature, who had prevented countless disasters through meticulous attention to detail and an unwavering commitment to safety. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his casual travel clothes, dark jeans, and a navy polo were chosen for comfort on the long flight ahead. Marcus had learned long ago that respect should never depend on a uniform or a suit, though he'd also learned that the world didn't always agree with that philosophy. "You almost ready, beautiful?" he called to his wife, who was in their bedroom finishing her packing. Dr. Sarah Mitchell emerged with a small wheeled suitcase and a smile that could light up a runway. At 42, Sarah was one of the most brilliant minds in aviation medicine. She held a PhD in aerospace engineering and an MD specializing in aviation medicine, and she spent her days writing the protocols that kept flight crews alert and passengers safe. Her work on pilot fatigue guidelines had literally saved thousands of lives, though she rarely talked about it. Sarah was elegant in that understated way that comes from intelligence and confidence rather than expensive clothes. Today she wore comfortable black pants and a soft gray sweater, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She carried herself with the grace of someone who had earned her place in rooms full of powerful men through brilliance and determination. 10 years, she said, reaching up to straighten Marcus's collar. "Can you believe it's been 10 years since we said, 'I do'?" Marcus smiled, remembering their wedding day. They'd met during a joint safety investigation 8 years before that, when Sarah had been brought in to analyze pilot error factors in a near-miss incident that Marcus was investigating from the mechanical side. She'd impressed him not just with her expertise, but with her ability to see the human element in what others treated as purely technical problems. "Best 10 years of my life," he said, pulling her close. "And Barcelona is going to be perfect. No regulations, no safety protocols, no emergency calls." They had booked this trip 6 months in advance, choosing Transatlantic's premium select cabin for the extra legroom and comfort on the 8-hour flight to Barcelona. It was their first real vacation in 3 years, and they had planned every detail: the boutique hotel in the Gothic Quarter, the cooking classes, the flamenco shows, the lazy mornings sleeping in without the sound of work phones buzzing with urgent federal business. As they loaded their bags into Marcus's car, both of their work phones began buzzing simultaneously. Marcus glanced at his screen, a text from his colleague at the FAA's Safety Assessment Division. "Marcus, we need to discuss the transatlantic pending safety review when you're back. Some concerning patterns emerging." Sarah's phone showed a message from her assistant, Dr. Mitchell. "The new discrimination complaint protocols you've been developing are being fast-tracked. Major incident reported involving federal personnel." They looked at each other and laughed. "Turn them off," Sarah said firmly. "Whatever it is, it can wait 12 days. Marcus powered down his phone with theatrical ceremony. "Doctor, Sarah Mitchell. You have just witnessed a federal inspector go completely off duty. Sarah did the same. And you have just witnessed the FAA's chief discrimination protocol developer take her first real break in 2 years. They had no idea that within hours they would become the major incident involving federal personnel that Sarah's assistant had mentioned. The drive to Dulles International Airport took 45 minutes through typical Washington traffic. They talked about their plans, laughed about Marcus's attempts to learn Spanish using an app, and discussed whether they should try to visit the Guggenheim in Bilbao if they had time. At the airport, they moved through the familiar rhythms of modern air travel check-in kiosks, security lines the long walk to their gate. Marcus carried their passports and boarding passes in a leather folio alongside his federal credentials that he carried everywhere out of habit. Sarah had her medical licenses and FAA identification in her purse documents that proved she was one of the most qualified aviation safety experts in the world. Neither of them thought about those credentials as they settled into the uncomfortable chairs at Gate B7, watching planes taxi past the windows. They were just Marcus and Sarah, a couple excited about their anniversary trip, completely unaware that they were about to become the center of a civil rights storm that would make national headlines. The first boarding call came at 2:45 p.m. We'd like to welcome our premium select and first-class passengers to begin boarding transatlantic flight 447 to Barcelona. Marcus stood and offered Sarah his arm with exaggerated gallantry. "Shall we, Mrs. Thompson-Mitchell?" She laughed and took his arm. "We shall, Mr. Thompson-Mitchell." They had hyphenated their names when they married a small decision that felt important to them. Today that decision would prove more significant than they could have imagined. As they walked toward the gate, Marcus felt the familiar flutter of pre-flight excitement. He'd flown thousands of miles for work, but vacation travel still felt special, full of possibility and adventure. Behind them, another passenger was also preparing to board. Maria Santos, a 28-year-old social media coordinator from Miami, had been watching the couple with interest. She'd noticed how comfortable they seemed together, how they moved with the easy synchronization of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. As a Latina who had faced her share of discrimination, Maria had also noticed the subtle once-overs they'd received from other passengers in the gate area, the quick glances and whispered conversations. Maria had a habit of documenting her travels on social media, and something about the atmosphere at the gate had put her on edge. She discreetly pulled out her phone and started recording. Not because she expected anything dramatic to happen, but because she'd learned that sometimes it was important to have a record of how people were treated. Marcus and Sarah approached the gate agent, a middle-aged white woman whose name tag read Jennifer Walsh. They handed over their boarding passes with smiles. Jennifer scanned the passes, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She looked at the passes again, then at Marcus and Sarah, then back at the passes. "Premium Select," she said, her tone carrying a note of surprise that made Marcus's smile fade slightly. "Yes," Sarah replied pleasantly. "Seats 7A and 7B." Jennifer held onto their boarding passes for a moment longer than necessary. "Priority boarding is typically for our frequent flyer members. Are you part of our rewards program?" Marcus reached for his wallet and pulled out his transatlantic rewards card gold level. "Yes, we are." Jennifer examined the card as if it might be counterfeit, then reluctantly handed back their boarding passes. "Enjoy your flight," she said, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced they would. As Marcus and Sarah walked down the jet bridge, Maria Santos was right behind them, her phone discreetly recording everything. The jet bridge felt longer than usual as Marcus and Sarah made their way toward the aircraft. The enclosed walkway hummed with the sound of air conditioning and the distant rumble of jet engines, but something else filled the space and tension that seemed to thicken with each step. Marcus had felt this feeling before. It was the weight of being watched, evaluated, and found wanting before he'd even spoken a word. It was the exhausting reality of being a successful black man in spaces where some people simply didn't expect to see him. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant stood greeting passengers with a practiced smile. Her name tag read Carmen Rodriguez, and she appeared to be in her late 30s with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and makeup applied with military precision. Carmen had been with Transatlantic for 12 years, working her way up from domestic routes to international flights, and she took pride in what she considered her ability to read passengers. "Welcome aboard Flight 447, Carmen said, as Marcus and Sarah approached. Her smile was bright and professional as they handed over their boarding passes. Carmen glanced at the passes, and Marcus watched something shift in her expression. It was subtle but unmistakable, the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her smile became a fraction more rigid. "Premium. Select," she said, her tone dropping several degrees in warmth. "Right this way." She led them into the cabin, but Marcus noticed how she moved now with a stiffness that hadn't been there when greeting the white passengers ahead of them. She walked them to their seats, 7A and 7B, spacious pods with dark navy leather and enough room to actually stretch out. "Are you familiar with our Premium Select service?" Carmen asked, her voice carrying an undertone that Marcus couldn't quite place. "We've flown Premium Select before," Sarah replied pleasantly, settling into her seat and immediately reaching for the safety card out of professional habit. Carmen watched Sarah examine the safety information with what appeared to be suspicion. "It's just that we sometimes have passengers who are unfamiliar with our premium cabin protocols." The implication hung in the air. Marcus felt Sarah's hand find his, a subtle signal that she'd heard it too. "We appreciate your concern," Marcus said evenly, "but we're quite comfortable with air travel." Behind Carmen, another crew member appeared. This was Jake Williams, the purser, a man in his early 50s with silver hair and an air of authority that he wore like a uniform. Jake had been with Transatlantic for 25 years, and in his mind, he'd earned the right to run his cabin the way he saw fit. Carmen leaned over to Jake and whispered something that Marcus couldn't hear, but he saw Jake's eyes flick toward them with sharp interest. Jake approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson Mitchell." "Is it, Dr. Mitchell?" Sarah corrected gently. "But yes, of course. I'm Jake Williams, the purser for this flight. I just need to verify your seat assignments one more time. We've had some computer glitches today." Marcus pulled out their boarding passes again. 7A and 7B Premium Select. Jake barely glanced at the passes. "Yes, I see that. It's just that our system shows these seats may have been double booked. It's a rare computer error, but it does happen occasionally." Marcus knew airline reservation computers intimately. It was part of his job to understand every aspect of airline operations, and double booking in premium cabins was virtually impossible with modern reservation systems. This was a fabrication, and not even a sophisticated one. "I can assure you our reservations are legitimate," Marcus said, his voice remaining calm despite the rising tension in his chest. "Oh, I'm not questioning their legitimacy," Jake replied smoothly. "It's just that we need to verify the purchase method. Premium Select seats are quite expensive, and sometimes there are irregularities in how they're acquired." Sarah's jaw tightened. She'd written papers on discrimination in transportation, and she recognized the coded language Jake was using. "What kind of irregularities?" "Well," Jake said, his tone becoming more pointed, "sometimes people find ways to access premium seats that weren't, shall we say, obtained through normal channels." The accusation was crystal clear. Jake was suggesting they had somehow fraudulently obtained their tickets, and his reasoning was transparently based on their appearance and his assumptions about what kind of people could afford premium cabin seats. Marcus felt the familiar weight of exhaustion that came with these encounters. He could fight at demand to speak to supervisors, make a scene. but it was his anniversary and all he wanted was to get to Barcelona with his wife and enjoy their vacation. "Our tickets were purchased 6 months ago with my credit card," Marcus said quietly. "If you need verification, you can check with your customer service department." Behind them, Maria Santos had taken her seat in row 9 and was discreetly continuing to record. She'd heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening, and her experience as a Latina woman in corporate America had taught her to recognize discrimination when she saw it. Other passengers were boarding now, and Marcus noticed how smoothly Jake and Carmen processed the white passengers around them. A businessman in an expensive suit was greeted warmly and offered champagne without any questions about his ticket legitimacy. An elderly white couple was helped to their seats with deferential attention. But when Jake returned to Marcus and Sarah, his demeanor shifted back to suspicion. "I'm going to need to see some additional identification," Jake announced loud enough that nearby passengers began to take notice. Additional identification for what Sarah asked, her professional demeanor beginning to crack. "It's standard procedure when there are questions about ticket validity," Carmen chimed in, though Marcus was certain this was not standard procedure at all. Marcus reached for his wallet, but something in him finally rebelled. "I've shown you our boarding passes, our frequent flyer cards, and offered to provide credit card verification. What exactly are you asking for?" Jake's expression hardened. "Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your voice." "I haven't raised my voice," Marcus replied, and indeed he hadn't. His tone remained level and controlled, but Jake was using a classic technique of tone policing to put Marcus on the defensive. "Look," Jake said loud enough that more passengers were now watching. "We have procedures for suspicious bookings. People try to scam their way into premium cabins all the time using fake cards, stolen information, that sort of thing." The word people carried weight that everyone in the vicinity understood. Sarah stood up, her face flushed with anger. "Are you accusing us of credit card fraud?" "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," Jake replied with false innocence. "I'm simply following our security protocols." By now, the interaction had drawn the attention of nearly everyone in the premium select cabin. An elderly white couple, Robert and Helen Barnes, exchanged uncomfortable glances. A young businessman named David Park looked up from his laptop with concern. But other passengers seemed to nod approvingly as if Jake was simply doing his job protecting them from undesirable elements. Marcus felt his phone buzzing in his pocket, but he ignored it. Whatever federal emergency was demanding his attention would have to wait. "What would it take to resolve this?" Marcus asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Well," Jake said, "if you could show me the actual credit card used for the purchase, and perhaps some additional documentation proving your identity." It was an impossible standard applied to no one else, and everyone knew it. Marcus and Sarah had been singled out for extra scrutiny based on one thing, only the color of Marcus's skin and Jake's assumptions about who belonged in premium cabins. Behind the growing crowd of onlookers, Captain Richard Burke had emerged from the cockpit to see what was causing the delay in boarding. Burke was 48, a veteran pilot who had flown for transatlantic for 15 years. He prided himself on running efficient flights and maintaining order in his aircraft. Burke observed the scene for a moment, taking in the black man and white woman who appeared to be causing a disturbance, the passengers watching with interest, and his crew's attempts to handle what appeared to be a security situation. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "Is there a problem here?" Burke asked, his captain's uniform lending additional authority to his words. Jake turned to him with visible relief. "Captain, we have a situation with these passengers. There are questions about their ticket validity and their being uncooperative with our verification procedures." Burke looked Marcus and Sarah up and down, his gaze lingering on Marcus in particular. "I see. What seems to be the issue?" "There's no issue," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "We have valid tickets for the seats we're occupying, and we've provided every form of identification that's been requested." Burke's expression suggested he wasn't convinced. Premium select passengers typically present differently, he said carefully. The euphemism was clear to everyone present. Marcus felt something snap inside him. Not anger exactly, but a crystalline clarity about what was happening and what it meant. This wasn't just about their vacation anymore. This was about every black professional who had been questioned in spaces where they belonged, every couple who had been made to feel unwelcome because they didn't fit someone else's narrow vision of who deserved respect. Captain Marcus said quietly, "I think you should be very careful about your next words." But Burke had already made up his mind about who these passengers were and what they represented. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." The cabin fell silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of ground crews preparing the aircraft for departure. Captain Burke's words hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt every eye in Premium Select focused on him. "Come with you," where Marcus asked, his voice deadly calm. Burke straightened his shoulders, the 4 gold stripes on his uniform sleeves catching the cabin light. "Off my aircraft. There appears to be some confusion about your tickets, and I won't have my crew questioned or intimidated." Sarah stood up, her face flushed with disbelief. "Intimidated? We've done nothing but answer questions and provide identification." Jake stepped forward, emboldened by his captain's support. "Ma'am, your husband became aggressive when we asked for simple verification." "That's a lie," Marcus said flatly. "I haven't raised my voice or made a single aggressive gesture." Carmen nodded vigorously. "He did seem threatening, Captain, and when we asked about their ticket purchase, they became defensive. The rewriting of history was happening in real time." Marcus watched as his calm responses were transformed into aggression, his reasonable questions twisted into defensiveness, his very presence reframed as threatening. Maria Santos, still recording from row 9, felt her heart racing. She'd seen this before, the way calm black men were characterized as dangerous, the way requesting basic respect was spun as making trouble. Her thumb hovered over her phone, making sure every word was captured. David Park, the young businessman, couldn't stay silent any longer. "Excuse me, but I've been watching this whole interaction. These passengers have been nothing but polite." Burke turned toward him with a sharp look. "Sir, please stay out of this. We're handling a security matter." "Security matter," David pressed. "What exactly is the security threat?" Jake jumped in. "Sir, these passengers presented questionable tickets and became uncooperative when we tried to verify their legitimacy." "I watched you process every other passenger in this cabin," David replied. "You didn't ask anyone else for additional identification or credit card verification." The truth of that statement hit the cabin like a physical force. Robert Barnes, the elderly white man in seat 5A, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd been flying for 40 years, and he'd never once been asked to prove he hadn't stolen his ticket. Burke's jaw tightened. "I need to maintain order on my aircraft. These passengers are creating a disturbance. The only disturbance I see," said a new voice, "is the discriminatory treatment being documented on multiple phones right now." Everyone turned to see Maria Santos standing in the aisle, her phone held openly now, no longer pretending to hide her recording. Carmen whirled toward her. "Ma'am, you need to sit down, and phones need to be put away during boarding." Maria didn't move. "The phones will stay out until this harassment stops." Helen Barnes, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up in a shaky voice. "This doesn't feel right. These seem like lovely people." Her husband Robert nodded reluctantly. "I have to agree. This seems excessive." Burke was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. The support he'd expected from his passengers wasn't materializing, and the presence of recording phones meant this incident wouldn't stay contained within his aircraft. "Everyone needs to take their seats," Burke announced. "We have a schedule to maintain." Marcus looked around the cabin, seeing the faces of passengers who ranged from uncomfortable to openly sympathetic. He made a decision that surprised even himself. "Captain, I'm going to make this very simple for you. My wife and I are going to sit in our assigned seats, which we paid for, and you're going to treat us with the same respect you'd show any other passengers." Or what Burke demanded. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket, his movement deliberate and slow. Several passengers held their breath, not knowing what to expect. What he pulled out was a black leather wallet, which he opened to reveal a gold federal badge. "Or you're going to explain to your airline's executives why you violated federal civil rights law against a senior air carrier safety inspector from the Federal Aviation Administration." The effect was immediate and devastating. Burke's face went white. Carmen took a step backward, as if she'd been slapped. Jake's mouth fell open. Sarah reached into her purse and withdrew her own credentials. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Chief Aero Medical Standards Consultant, FAA. I believe you were questioning our qualifications." The cabin erupted in whispers. Maria Santos captured Burke's expression of pure horror as the reality hit him. David Park let out a low whistle. The Barnes couple looked at each other with wide eyes. Burke's career flashed before his eyes. 15 years of flying, thousands of successful flights, his retirement pension, his family's financial security. All of it potentially destroyed by his decision to trust his crew's assessment of passengers based on their appearance. "Sir. Ma'am. Burke stammered, but Marcus held up a hand. "Captain Burke. What's your employee number?" Burke's voice came out as a whisper. 4751. Carmen Rodriguez. Employee number. Carmen was trembling now. 2847. Jake Williams. Jake couldn't speak. He just shook his head, the weight of 25 years with the airline suddenly feeling like an anchor dragging him down. Sarah's voice cut through the silence like a scalpel. "Gentlemen, lady, you've just committed multiple federal violations. Discrimination based on race, denial of services paid for in good faith, and harassment of federal aviation safety officers." Marcus's phone, which had been buzzing consistently, finally demanded his attention. He answered it without taking his eyes off Burke. "Thompson. Marcus, thank God. We need you to emergency inspect a transatlantic flight. We've had reports of crew misconduct and potential safety violations." Marcus looked around the cabin at the faces watching him, at his wife's tight expression, at the crew members who had just destroyed their careers. "I'm already on it," he said into the phone. "This is Flight 447, and I'm implementing an immediate crew safety evaluation." Burke found his voice. "Sir, please, we didn't know." "You didn't know what?" Sarah interrupted. "That we were human beings deserving of basic respect, that paying customers shouldn't be harassed and humiliated because of their race." Carmen was crying now, mascara starting to run down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I just thought." "You thought what?" Marcus asked. "That black people can't afford premium seats, that interracial couples are automatically suspicious, that your assumptions were more important than our dignity." The weight of their actions was crushing the crew. Jake, who had been so confident in his authority minutes earlier, was now faced with the reality that his prejudices had been exposed in front of dozens of witnesses, recorded on multiple phones, and directed at two of the most powerful people in aviation safety. Maria Santos had stopped recording and was now openly applauding. "This is justice," she said loudly. "This is what accountability looks like." David Park stood up. "Sir, ma'am, for what it's worth, this passenger witnessed everything. These crew members profiled you from the moment you boarded." Other passengers were nodding agreement. The Barnes couple looked ashamed, realizing they had initially been willing to go along with the discrimination because it didn't affect them directly. Burke made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Please, we can make this right. We can upgrade you to first class, provide compensation." Captain Marcus interrupted. "You can't bribe your way out of civil rights violations." Sarah was already on her phone. Dr. Mitchell here. I need to report a federal incident involving airline discrimination against FAA personnel. Flight 447 Transatlantic Airways, currently at Gate B7, Dulles International. The words federal incident seemed to echo through the cabin. Passengers realized they were witnessing something that would make national news. Burke's radio crackled to life. Captain Burke, this is operations. We're receiving reports of an incident on your aircraft. What's your status? Burke looked at the radio, then at Marcus and Sarah, then at his crew. His hand shook as he reached for the radio. Operations, this is Flight 447. We have a federal situation requiring immediate ground supervisor response. Copy that, 447. Supervisors en route. Marcus looked at his watch. 17 minutes. From boarding to federal investigation in 17 minutes. That might be a record. Sarah squeezed his hand. I'm proud of you for staying calm. Marcus squeezed back. I'm proud of us for not backing down. Around them, the cabin was buzzing with conversation. Passengers were texting, making calls, posting to social media. The hashtag transatlantic discrimination was about to explode across the internet. Carmen was sobbing openly now. My kids. I have kids. I can't lose this job. Marcus felt a flicker of sympathy, but Sarah's voice was steel. You should have thought about your children before you decided to humiliate paying passengers. Jake had sat down heavily in the front row, his head in his hands. 25 years of seniority, his pension, his reputation in the industry. Gone because he couldn't see past his own prejudices. Burke keyed his radio again. Operations passengers are disembarking for the federal investigation. We'll need a gate hold. Copy 447. Airport security and airline management en route to your location. Marcus stood up and addressed the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that your flight has been delayed due to this incident. Those of you who witnessed what occurred today, you may be contacted by federal investigators. Thank you for your support. As if choreographed, nearly every passenger in Premium Select stood and began applauding. Maria Santos was crying. David Park was shaking his head in amazement, and even the Barnes couple were clapping with tears in their eyes. The applause built and spread, passengers from economy class standing up to see what was happening, flight attendants from other crews gathering at the cabin divider to witness the scene. Sarah looked at her husband with admiration and love, ready to change the world. Marcus smiled for the first time since boarding. With you, always. As they gathered their belongings, preparing to meet with federal investigators, neither of them could have imagined the shockwaves their 17 minutes of courage would send through the aviation industry. The crew of Flight 447 was about to learn that some mistakes don't just get you fired. Some mistakes change federal law. The next 20 minutes unfolded like a carefully orchestrated nightmare. But instead of Marcus and Sarah being the victims, the tables had completely turned. Airport security arrived at the gate in the form of two officers, Roberto Martinez and Jennifer Walsh, both of whom had been expecting to handle a routine passenger removal situation. What they found instead was a cabin full of agitated passengers, a crew in various stages of emotional breakdown, and two federal aviation inspectors who had just documented multiple civil rights violations on video. Officer Martinez, a 10-year veteran of airport security, approached Captain Burke first. Captain, we received a call about disruptive passengers. Burke's voice cracked as he responded. Officer, there's been a misunderstanding. These passengers are federal employees. Sarah stepped forward, her credentials already in her hand. Officers, I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, FAA Chief Aeromedical Standards Division. This is my husband, Marcus Thompson, Senior Air Carrier Safety Inspector. We've just documented extensive discrimination by this crew. Officer Walsh examined their credentials with growing alarm. Federal badges were unmistakable, and both Marcus and Sarah carried the kind of high-level security clearances that made airport security officers very nervous about making mistakes. Ma'am, can you walk me through what happened here? Marcus gestured toward Maria Santos, who was still recording everything. This passenger captured the entire interaction on video. We were harassed, profiled, and ultimately threatened with removal because this crew assumed we couldn't afford our tickets. Carmen, who had been sobbing quietly, suddenly erupted. We didn't know. We thought they were trying to scam their way into premium seats. People do it all the time. Officer Martinez turned to her sharply. Ma'am, are you saying you targeted these passengers based on their appearance? Jake tried to salvage the situation. It was a legitimate security concern. Their tickets seemed suspicious. David Park, who had been watching from his seat, stood up. Officer, I'm a corporate attorney, and I witnessed this entire incident. These crew members never asked any other passenger for additional identification. The discrimination was obvious and documented. Maria Santos held up her phone. I've got video of the whole thing. They profiled this couple from the moment they stepped on the plane. Other passengers began speaking up, their voices overlapping in a chorus of support for Marcus and Sarah. The elderly Barnes couple, despite their initial discomfort, found their voices. This was wrong, Helen Barnes said firmly. Completely wrong. These are clearly educated professional people who were treated terribly. Her husband Robert nodded. I've been flying for 40 years and I've never seen anything like this. It was pure prejudice, plain and simple. Officer Walsh was making notes rapidly, realizing that what had started as a routine call was turning into a federal incident with multiple witnesses and video evidence. Captain Burke Officer Martinez said, we're going to need you and your crew to come with us for questioning. Burke's face was gray with shock. What about our flight schedule? We have passengers to transport. Marcus stepped forward. Captain, as a senior FAA safety inspector, I'm implementing an immediate crew fitness evaluation. You and your crew are suspended from flight duties pending federal investigation. The weight of those words hit like a physical blow. Burke grabbed the nearest seat for support. Carmen's sobs became wails. Jake just stared straight ahead, his face blank with shock. Sarah was on her phone with the FAA's crisis management team. Yes, this is Dr. Mitchell. I need immediate supervisor response to Dulles Gate B7, transatlantic flight 447. Multiple violations, hostile crew, federal personnel targeted. Yes, I'll hold for the director. The passengers in the cabin were rapidly taking sides, with the vast majority supporting Marcus and Sarah. A few passengers, uncomfortable with the turn of events, tried to distance themselves, but their voices were drowned out by the growing chorus of support. Maria Santos had switched to live streaming and her viewer count was climbing rapidly. Y'all, this is insane. This airline crew just discriminated against federal aviation inspectors, the people who literally keep planes safe, and they got caught on camera doing it. The comments on her stream were exploding. This is why we need to record everything. Sue them into bankruptcy. Those crew members just ended their careers. Justice being served in real time. Burke's radio crackled again. Captain Burke. This is VP of Operations, Patricia Valdez. What is your status? Burke looked at the radio like it was a snake. He knew that Patricia Valdez was one of the most powerful executives at Transatlantic, and he was about to deliver news that would ruin her day, her quarter, and possibly her career. Ma'am, we have a federal incident involving crew discrimination against FAA personnel. The flight is suspended, crew is suspended, and federal investigators are en route. The silence on the radio stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Valdez's voice returned, barely controlled. Did you just say discrimination against FAA personnel? Yes, ma'am. Jesus Christ, Burke. Hold position. Do not speak to anyone else until our legal team arrives. But it was far too late for damage control. Word was already spreading through the airport. Airline employees were gathering at nearby gates, and social media was beginning to light up with the story. Marcus received a call from his supervisor, Director James Harrison. Marcus, I'm getting emergency calls about Flight 447. Please tell me you're not involved in whatever's happening. James. I'm not just involved. Sarah and I are the victims. Transatlantic crew discriminated against us, tried to remove us from our paid seats, and created a federal incident. We need full investigation protocols. Harrison's sigh was audible. How bad is it? Marcus looked around the cabin at the crying flight attendants, the ashamed captain, the angry passengers, and the security officers taking statements. James, this is going to be a career-ending disaster for multiple people and a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for Transatlantic. I'll have a full team there within an hour. Sarah had finished her call and was now speaking with a representative from the Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Office. Yes, we have video evidence, multiple witness statements, and clear documentation of discriminatory treatment. No, we cannot resolve this informally. This requires full federal investigation. Officer Martinez approached Marcus and Sarah. Sir, ma'am, we need to separate the crew for individual statements. Would you be willing to provide your account of events? Absolutely, Marcus replied. But I wanted on record that we were treated with dignity by airport security. The discrimination came entirely from airline crew. As they prepared to leave the aircraft for formal statements, Marcus turned to address the passengers one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your support today. What you witnessed was discrimination, pure and simple. Your willingness to speak up to record what happened and to demand better treatment for all passengers gives me hope that we can change this industry. The applause that followed was thunderous. Passengers were standing, some crying, all recognizing that they had witnessed something historic. Carmen Rodriguez made one final, desperate plea. Please, Dr. Mitchell, Mr. Thompson, I have 3 children. I can't lose my job. I made a mistake. Sarah looked at her with a mixture of sadness and steel. Carmen, you didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose to judge us by our skin color instead of our character. You chose to humiliate paying passengers because they didn't fit your assumptions. Those weren't mistakes. Those were decisions. Marcus added quietly. Decisions have consequences. As they walked off the aircraft, followed by security officers and trailed by passengers offering support, neither Marcus nor Sarah felt victorious. They felt exhausted, angry, and determined to ensure that what had happened to them would never happen to anyone else. Behind them, Captain Burke sat alone in the cockpit, staring at his hands and wondering how 15 years of flying had just evaporated because he trusted his crew's prejudices more than his passengers' dignity. Carmen Rodriguez was escorted to a security office, her career effectively over her children's financial security destroyed by her inability to see past the color of a passenger's skin. Jake Williams followed in handcuffs not because he was being arrested, but because standard procedure required restraint for crew members involved in federal aviation incidents. His 25 years of seniority, his pension, his industry reputation, all gone in the span of one disastrous flight that never even took off. Maria Santos continued streaming as she walked through the terminal, her viewer count now over 100,000 and climbing. Justice was served today, she told her audience. But it shouldn't take federal badges for people to be treated with basic human respect. The ripple effects were already beginning. Transatlantic's stock price had started dropping as news of the incident spread. Aviation industry forums were buzzing with discussion. Civil rights organizations were preparing statements. Legal experts were being contacted by news outlets for commentary. And in the security office at Dulles International Airport, Marcus Thompson and Dr. Sarah Mitchell began giving statements that would change the aviation industry forever. Their anniversary trip to Barcelona would have to wait. They had more important work to do. The security office at Dulles International Airport had been transformed into what looked like a federal command center. Within 90 minutes of Marcus and Sarah being escorted off Flight 447, the room buzzed with activity that would have been impressive if it weren't so terrifying for the transatlantic crew members sitting in separate interview rooms. Marcus sat across from FAA Director James Harrison, who had driven directly from Washington the moment he learned that two of his top inspectors had been discriminated against. Harrison was a calm, methodical man who had spent 30 years in aviation safety, but his jaw was tight with controlled anger. "Walk me through this again, Marcus." "From the beginning." Marcus recounted the entire incident while Sarah provided corroborating details from her separate interview room down the hall. Their stories matched perfectly because they were telling the truth, something that couldn't be said for the crew members who were being interviewed by federal investigators. In the first interview room, Carmen Rodriguez sat across from civil rights investigator Patricia Williams and FAA Inspector Michael Chen. Carmen's earlier tears had dried, replaced by a desperate attempt to minimize her role in the incident. "I wasn't trying to discriminate," Carmen insisted. "I just thought their tickets looked unusual." "Unusual?" how Williams asked. "Well, Premium Select is expensive and they were dressed so casually and what Carmen's voice dropped to a whisper. "And they didn't look like our typical premium passengers." Williams made a note. "Can you describe what a typical premium passenger looks like?" The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Carmen realized she had just admitted to racial profiling on the record. In the second interview room, Jake Williams was having an even worse time with Transportation Department investigator Robert Martinez and FAA Inspector Lisa Chang. Jake had decided to take a defensive approach, which was proving to be a catastrophic mistake. "Look, we get scammers all the time," Jake insisted. "People with fake cards, stolen identities trying to sneak into premium cabins. I was just doing my job. How many white passengers have you subjected to additional identity verification in the past year?" Martinez asked. Jake hesitated. "I don't keep track of race." "That's interesting because we pulled your incident reports for the past 12 months. You've filed 17 suspicious passenger reports. 15 were for passengers of color. Care to explain that pattern?" Jake's face went white as he realized his own documentation had condemned him. Captain Burke was in the third interview room with the most senior investigators, FAA Deputy Administrator Sarah Johnson and DOT Civil Rights Director Maria Fernandez. Burke had chosen to cooperate fully, hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of his career. "Captain, you understand that as pilot in command, you bear ultimate responsibility for everything that happens on your aircraft." "Yes, ma'am. Including discrimination against paying passengers." Burke's voice was barely audible. "Yes, ma'am. Can you explain to me how a senior FAA safety inspector and the chief of aeromedical standards ended up being harassed and threatened with removal from your aircraft?" Burke had no good answer because there was no good answer. He had trusted his crew's assessment of passengers based on appearance rather than facts, and now his career was over. Meanwhile, in the main security office, Patricia Valdez, Transatlantic's VP of Operations, was experiencing every airline executive's worst nightmare. She sat across from Marcus and Sarah while her legal team huddled nearby, trying to contain a situation that was spiraling completely out of control. Dr. Mitchell, Mr. Thompson Valdez began, "Please understand that this incident does not represent Transatlantic's values or policies. We take discrimination very seriously." Sarah's response was ice cold. "Patricia, may I call you Patricia? Your crew subjected us to humiliation and discrimination that was documented on video and witnessed by dozens of passengers. Your captain threatened to have federal aviation inspectors arrested for the crime of flying while black. How exactly does that not represent your airline's values?" Marcus leaned forward. "Patricia, in the past 18 months, how many discrimination complaints has Transatlantic received?" Valdez glanced at her legal team nervously. "I don't have those numbers readily available." "I do," Marcus replied, pulling out his phone. 47 formal complaints alleging racial discrimination. 47 all dismissed as unsubstantiated or resolved through minor compensation. That's not a few bad apples. That's institutional bias. The legal implications were staggering. If Marcus and Sarah could prove a pattern of discrimination, Transatlantic faced not just federal fines, but massive class action lawsuits from every passenger who had been discriminated against. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. Dr. Mitchell news crews are arriving at the airport. This is going national. Indeed, word had leaked to the press with remarkable speed. Maria Santos's live stream had been picked up by major news outlets, and the story was spreading across social media like wildfire. The hashtag transatlantic discrimination was trending nationally. Video clips of the crew's breakdown were being shared thousands of times. News vans were pulling up to Dulles International Airport. In Transatlantic's corporate headquarters, CEO Thomas Brady was being briefed on what his communications director called the worst PR crisis in company history. "Sir, 2 federal aviation inspectors were discriminated against by our crew. It's on video. It's going viral. Our stock is down 12% and falling." Brady felt physically sick. He had spent 10 years building Transatlantic's reputation, and it was collapsing in real time because of the actions of 3 crew members who couldn't see past their own prejudices. Back at the airport, the investigation was uncovering evidence that the problem went deeper than just Flight 447. Federal investigators had seized Transatlantic's training materials and discovered protocols that, while not explicitly discriminatory, created frameworks that led to biased enforcement. Flight attendants were trained to identify suspicious passengers using criteria that disproportionately targeted people of color. Gate agents were encouraged to verify premium passengers who didn't fit certain profiles. Captains were given broad authority to remove passengers based on crew recommendations. Marcus reviewed the training materials with growing anger. "This isn't unconscious bias, Sarah. This is trained discrimination masquerading as security protocol." Sarah was examining incident reports on her laptop. "Marcus, look at this. In the past year, Transatlantic removed or denied boarding to 89 passengers for suspicious behavior or questionable tickets. Want to guess the racial breakdown?" The statistics were damning. 78 of the 89 passengers were people of color. 45 were black passengers. 23 were Hispanic. 10 were Asian. Only 11 were white, and those cases involved actual security threats or fraudulent documents. Director Harrison joined them as they reviewed the data. "This is beyond individual crew prejudice. This is pattern discrimination that rises to the level of federal civil rights violations." Outside the security office, news crews were setting up for live broadcasts. The story was being covered not just as an aviation incident, but as a major civil rights case, with implications for the entire transportation industry. Carmen Rodriguez was led out in handcuffs, not because she was being arrested, but because federal procedure required restraint for individuals involved in civil rights violations. The image of her being escorted through the airport while news cameras rolled would become iconic. Jake Williams followed his head down 25 years of airline service, ending in disgrace. His union representative walked beside him, but there was little that could be done. Discrimination against federal officers while on duty was a career-ending offense. Captain Burke was the last to be escorted out. The sight of a 4-stripe airline captain being led away in handcuffs made every aviation news website and would be replayed on evening news broadcasts across the country. As the crew members were being processed, Marcus and Sarah received a call that changed everything. It was from Attorney General Rebecca Martinez, the highest law enforcement official in the United States. "Dr. Mitchell, Mr. Thompson. I've been briefed on your situation. The Department of Justice is opening a formal civil rights investigation into Transatlantic Airways. We want to know if you'd be willing to serve as expert witnesses." Marcus and Sarah looked at each other. They had gone from anniversary travelers to federal civil rights case plaintiffs in less than 6 hours. "We'll do whatever is necessary to ensure this never happens again," Sarah replied. Maria Santos, who had been waiting in the terminal, was approached by a CNN correspondent who had seen her live stream. "Would you be willing to appear on our evening broadcast? Your video is the key evidence in this case." Maria nodded. "People need to see what really happened. This can't be hidden or minimized." Transatlantic stock continued to plummet as investors realized the company faced potentially hundreds of millions in federal fines, lawsuits, and regulatory sanctions. Emergency board meetings were being called. Crisis management firms were being hired. But the damage went beyond financial. The airline's reputation was in freefall. Corporate clients were canceling contracts. Travel agencies were warning customers about potential discrimination. Other airlines were quietly reviewing their own policies to avoid similar scandals. As evening approached, Marcus and Sarah stood in the airport terminal watching news crews broadcast their story to the nation. They weren't sure how they felt. Vindicated, certainly. Angry, absolutely. But also sad that it had taken federal badges and national media attention for them to be treated as human beings, deserving of basic respect. "Ready to go home?" Marcus asked. Sarah squeezed his hand. "Not yet. We have work to do." Their anniversary trip to Barcelona had been canceled, but they had inadvertently launched something much more important, a reckoning that would reshape the aviation industry and send a message that discrimination would no longer be tolerated at 35,000 feet or anywhere else. The crew of Flight 447 had thought they were removing troublesome passengers. Instead, they had awakened a sleeping giant that would transform civil rights in transportation forever. The federal investigation that erupted from the Flight 447 incident moved with the speed and precision of a military operation. Within 48 hours, teams of investigators from the FAA, Department of Transportation, Department of Justice, and FBI had descended on transatlantic airways like a swarm of very well-educated locusts. Marcus and Sarah found themselves at the center of what had become the largest aviation civil rights investigation in decades. Their quiet anniversary weekend had been transformed into a series of depositions, interviews, and evidence reviews that would reshape federal transportation policy. At the FBI's Washington field office, Special Agent Jennifer Walsh was coordinating the digital forensics team that was analyzing everything from crew training materials to internal corporate communications. What they were finding painted a picture of an airline that had allowed discriminatory practices to flourish under the guise of security protocols, Dr. Mitchell Agent Walsh said as Sarah reviewed email threads on a large monitor. "Can you walk me through what you're seeing here?" Sarah pointed to a chain of emails between transatlantic training supervisors. This email from Regional Training Manager David Phillips says, "Remember to coach crews on identifying passengers who may not be legitimate premium customers. Look for obvious mismatches between passenger presentation and ticket class." The response from Training Supervisor Linda Morrison says, "Got it. The usual suspects." The coded language was clear to anyone who understood corporate speak. The usual suspects meant passengers of color who had the audacity to purchase premium cabin tickets. Meanwhile, Marcus was working with FAA investigators to analyze passenger complaint data that Transatlantic had been required to file, but had buried in bureaucratic language that obscured patterns of discrimination. "Look at this," Marcus said, highlighting entries in a database. Complaint: 2847 passenger became agitated when asked for additional verification. Complaint: 3012 passenger claimed discrimination when crew followed security protocols. Complaint: 3156. Passenger used race card to avoid compliance with verification procedures. FAA. Inspector Michael Rodriguez leaned over Marcus's shoulder. "Let me guess, all the complainants were people of color." Marcus pulled up the demographic data. Every single one. And look at the resolution. No policy violation found. Crew acted within guidelines. Passenger education provided about appropriate travel behavior. The pattern was unmistakable. Transatlantic had created a system that allowed discrimination to flourish while providing legal cover through carefully worded policies and complaint resolution procedures. At Transatlantic's corporate headquarters, the mood was somewhere between funeral and natural disaster. CEO Thomas Brady sat in an emergency board meeting watching his company's reputation collapse in real time. "Gentlemen, ladies," Brady addressed the board. "Our legal team estimates we're facing federal fines of up to $50 million, civil lawsuits that could exceed $200 million, and regulatory sanctions that could include suspension of our operating certificate." Board member Patricia Williams raised her hand. "Tom, how did this happen? How did we not know our crews were discriminating against passengers?" Brady's chief legal officer, Robert Martinez, answered. "With respect, Patricia, we did know. Our complaint data showed clear patterns of disparate treatment of passengers of color. We chose to interpret it as isolated incidents rather than an operational problem." The silence in the boardroom was deafening. Every member understood that they had collectively failed in their fiduciary duty to prevent discrimination, and now they were facing potential personal liability, as well as corporate disaster. Meanwhile, the story had exploded across national media. The image of federal aviation inspectors being harassed by airline crew had struck a nerve with the American public. Op-ed writers were calling it a symbol of institutional racism in corporate America. Civil rights leaders were demanding congressional hearings. Aviation unions were scrambling to distance themselves from the discriminatory crew members. Maria Santos had become an inadvertent celebrity, her video viewed over 5 million times, and her testimony featured on every major news network. She was using her platform to highlight discrimination in the travel industry. "This isn't just about one airline or one flight," Maria said during a CNN interview. "This is about how black and brown people are treated when they dare to occupy spaces that some people think they don't belong in." The ripple effects were spreading throughout the aviation industry. Other airlines were conducting emergency reviews of their policies and training materials. Flight attendant unions were implementing new discrimination awareness programs. The Association of Professional Flight Attendants issued a statement condemning the actions of the transatlantic crew. Captain Richard Burke had become a pariah in the aviation community. Fellow pilots crossed the street to avoid him. His union representative told him bluntly that they would provide minimal legal support because his actions were indefensible. Burke sat in his empty house, his wife having taken their children to stay with her parents until the media attention died down. His phone rang constantly with reporters seeking comments, legal notices, and former colleagues expressing their disappointment. Carmen Rodriguez was facing an even bleaker future. Her firing from Transatlantic had been immediate, and with cause, meaning she received no severance and no recommendation for future employment. Her FAA flight attendant certificate had been suspended, pending the federal investigation, effectively barring her from working in commercial aviation. With 3 children and a mortgage, Carmen was discovering that discrimination had consequences that extended far beyond the moment of poor judgment. She had applied for retail jobs, waitressing positions, anything that would pay bills, but her name was now synonymous with airline discrimination, making her virtually unemployable. Jake Williams was learning that 25 years of seniority meant nothing when you became the face of corporate prejudice. His pension was frozen pending the outcome of the federal investigation. His industry contacts were avoiding his calls. His reputation as a professional flight attendant was destroyed beyond repair. The 3 crew members had thought they were enforcing company policies and protecting premium cabin passengers from undesirable elements. Instead, they had exposed an entire industry's tolerance for discrimination and triggered reforms that would affect every airline in America. The investigation was uncovering evidence that Transatlantic's problems went far beyond the actions of 3 crew members. Internal documents showed that complaints of discrimination were routinely dismissed or minimized. Training materials used coded language that encouraged profiling. Performance evaluations rewarded crews for maintaining cabin standards that had clear racial undertones. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was particularly disturbed by the aeromedical implications of what they were discovering. Marcus. If crews are making decisions based on passenger appearance rather than behavior, they're not just discriminating, they're compromising flight safety. What happens when they miss actual security threats because they're focused on harassing law-abiding passengers? The question highlighted a dangerous paradox. Discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was operationally counterproductive. By focusing on passengers who didn't belong rather than actual security concerns, crews were creating the very problems they claimed to be preventing. Federal investigators were also discovering that transatlantic's discrimination problems extended beyond race. Data showed patterns of bias against passengers with disabilities, LGBTQ+ travelers, and customers whose English wasn't perfect. The airline had created a culture where crew members felt empowered to judge passengers based on appearance, accent, or perceived social status. Attorney General Rebecca Martinez announced that the Justice Department would be seeking unprecedented penalties against Transatlantic. This case represents more than individual prejudice, Martinez said at a press conference. It represents a corporate culture that prioritized bias over basic human dignity. The announcement sent Transatlantic's stock price into freefall. The airline that had once prided itself on premium service was now synonymous with discrimination and humiliation. Corporate clients were canceling contracts en masse. International partners were reconsidering codeshare agreements. Marcus and Sarah were working 18-hour days with federal investigators reviewing evidence, providing expert testimony, and helping design new protocols that would prevent future discrimination. Their anniversary trip had been replaced by the most important work of their careers. "You know," Sarah said as they reviewed training materials late one evening, "maybe this is how we were supposed to spend our anniversary. Fighting for justice." Marcus smiled and squeezed her hand. "If this prevents one other couple from going through what we experienced, it'll be worth it." The investigation was revealing the true scope of Transatlantic's discrimination problem, but it was also demonstrating that change was possible when people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The crew of Flight 447 had thought they were removing passengers who didn't belong. Instead, they had sparked a revolution that would ensure all passengers were treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. Their moment of prejudice had become a catalyst for progress that would transform the aviation industry forever. 6 months after Flight 447 never took off. The consequences of those 17 minutes had reshaped the aviation industry in ways that no one could have predicted. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and aviation industry officials as Judge Maria Rodriguez prepared to announce the final settlement in United States versus Transatlantic Airways. Marcus and Sarah sat in the front row, their hands intertwined, watching as justice finally arrived for the discrimination they had endured. Behind them sat Maria Santos, David Park, and Robert and Helen Barnes, the passengers whose witness testimony had been crucial to the federal case. Judge Rodriguez looked up from her papers with the gravity that comes with decisions that will be studied in law schools for decades. The court finds that Transatlantic Airways engaged in intentional discrimination against Dr. Sarah Mitchell and Mr. Marcus Thompson based on race in violation of federal civil rights law. The gavel came down like thunder. Transatlantic Airways was ordered to pay $3, $2 million in federal fines, the largest civil rights penalty ever imposed on an airline. The company was required to implement comprehensive bias prevention training for all employees, establish an independent civil rights monitoring board, and submit to 5 years of federal oversight. CEO Thomas Brady had been forced to resign in disgrace. The new CEO, Maria Fernandez, was a civil rights attorney who had built her career fighting discrimination in corporate America. Her first official act was to issue a public apology to Marcus and Sarah and announce the establishment of the Thompson-Mitchell Civil Rights Initiative within the airline. Carmen Rodriguez sat in the gallery, barely recognizing herself from 6 months earlier. Her career in aviation was over. Her finances destroyed, her family struggling to survive on her husband's income alone. She had become a cautionary tale told in diversity training sessions across the industry. Jake Williams was facing personal bankruptcy. His pension had been forfeited, his industry contacts had abandoned him, and he was working night shifts at a warehouse trying to support a family while dealing with the depression that comes with having your life's work revealed as a monument to prejudice. Captain Richard Burke had lost everything. His pilot's license was permanently revoked, his reputation destroyed beyond repair. He sat in the courtroom's back row, a broken man who had learned too late that command authority means nothing without moral clarity. But the real victory wasn't in the punishment of those who had discriminated. It was in the transformation their actions had triggered. The Thompson-Mitchell Protocol had become the gold standard for preventing discrimination in transportation. Named after Marcus and Sarah, the protocol required airlines to document all passenger verification requests, undergo regular bias auditing, and implement real-time discrimination reporting. Marcus had been promoted to Director of Aviation Civil Rights Enforcement, a new position created specifically to prevent future incidents like Flight 447. His first initiative was launching surprise audits of airline operations with federal investigators posing as passengers to test for discriminatory treatment. Sarah had become Chief Bias Prevention Officer for the FAA. Writing new regulations that required airlines to prove their policies didn't have disparate racial impacts. Her aeromedical expertise had helped identify how discrimination actually compromised flight safety by distracting crews from legitimate security concerns. The changes weren't just regulatory. The story of Flight 447 had sparked a cultural shift in aviation. Flight attendant training now included extensive civil rights education. Passenger service representatives learned to check their assumptions. Captains understood that their authority came with responsibility to protect all passengers' dignity. Maria Santos had parlayed her accidental activism into a career fighting transportation discrimination. She now worked for the Civil Rights Coalition documenting bias incidents and helping passengers navigate complaint processes. David Park, the businessman who had spoken up in the cabin, had become an advocate for bystander intervention training. If you see discrimination, he told corporate audiences, your silence makes you complicit. Even Robert and Helen Barnes, the elderly couple who had initially been uncomfortable, had become civil rights advocates in their retirement community, speaking about the importance of standing up for others even when it's uncomfortable. The ripple effects had spread far beyond aviation. The Transportation Equity Act, passed by Congress in response to the Flight 447 incident, established federal civil rights protections across all forms of commercial transportation. The law was signed by the president in a ceremony attended by Marcus and Sarah. As the court session ended, Marcus and Sarah walked out of the courthouse hand in hand. They were surrounded by reporters, but they had agreed to give only one statement. Sarah stepped to the microphones. 6 months ago, we were just a couple trying to take an anniversary trip. We became symbols of something much larger, the idea that respect isn't earned by the size of your wallet or the color of your skin. It's the basic dignity that every human being deserves. Marcus added, we didn't fight this battle for ourselves. We fought for everyone who comes after us, so they won't have to endure what we experienced. The settlement had included a personal award of $2.8 million to Marcus and Sarah, which they immediately donated to civil rights organizations working to combat discrimination in transportation and hospitality. But the real measure of their victory wasn't monetary. It was the letter Marcus had received from a young black engineer who wrote, I flew first class for the first time last month. The crew treated me with respect and professionalism. I thought of you and Dr. Mitchell and realized that your courage made my dignity possible. 3 weeks later, Marcus and Sarah finally took their anniversary trip to Barcelona. They flew first class on a different airline, and the crew, aware of their story, treated them with genuine warmth and respect. As their plane lifted off, Sarah looked at her husband. It wasn't the trip we planned. Marcus squeezed her hand. But it was the journey we needed to take. The crew of Flight 447 had thought they were removing passengers who didn't belong. Instead, they had sparked a revolution that ensured all passengers would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. Their moment of prejudice had become a catalyst for progress that transformed not just the aviation industry but the very idea of what equality means in America. 6 months after the settlement, Marcus and Sarah finally made it to Barcelona for their rescheduled anniversary trip. They flew first class on Iberian Airways, where the crew knew their story and treated them with genuine warmth. As they settled into their seats, the flight attendant smiled and said, "Mr. and Dr. Thompson Mitchell, it's an honor to have you aboard today." The transformation was measurable. Discrimination complaints in aviation dropped 89% industry-wide after implementation of the Thompson-Mitchell Protocol. Over 15,000 airline employees completed new civil rights training. The protocol was adopted by Amtrak bus companies and cruise lines, extending its impact across all transportation sectors. Their legacy lived on. Every new flight attendant learned about Flight 447 in training. Aviation schools taught the case as a cornerstone of professional ethics. Marcus and Sarah's quiet courage had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't anger. It's the dignified refusal to accept that discrimination is simply the way things are. They had shown that respect isn't a privilege to be earned but a right to be protected, and that when ordinary people refuse to tolerate injustice, they can change entire industries and create a more just world for everyone. If this story of courage and justice resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of when dignity defeats discrimination. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. What did you think of Marcus and Sarah's response? Let us know in the comments below. Remember, change happens when good people refuse to stay silent. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.